What's going on, everyone? So I have a little bit of a spicy one for you today. This is a response from the head judge of the Las Vegas Planetary Qualifier, which is a continuation of our video yesterday. Now, they're not responding to my video, as you can see from the date from these posts. It was actually made before my video, and it was more of responding to the event in of its entirety because there was a ton of community backlash. And this is something that is very, very important because so many of you commented on my previous video and so many of you had so many upvotes for very, very big action in association with disqualifying the player, making sure these things don't ever happen again, etc., etc., etc. And not only that, but also a ton of the community came forward and said, yeah, everything that we went over was basically how it happened, and it was as bad as a lot of people make it seem. However, today's post from the head judge makes it seem like it's actually not as bad as a lot of you had said. So I wanted to go over it today because, again, this is something that I feel not just strongly about because it's important for our community, but also I'm like the only one that can actually give a voice to this stuff. Why do I say that? Because I am not limited by the FFG creator restrictions. I don't even know if they have any in this regard, or maybe they just don't want to step on FFG's toes or what. But I haven't really seen a lot of videos or talk about this outside of like the Reddit or outside of personal community dealings. And that might be because, well, these are FFG sanctioned events, and without, going through approval through FFG, they may not be able to talk about this stuff. And so as someone who is able to make videos on kind of whatever he wants, although within reason and trying to actually give at least some voice to the people involved, I feel like I have a unique position in this regard, and I wanted to talk about it more, especially since we got a response from the head judge in terms of how it went down in the event. Not a response to my video again, but just a response in general. And there's a lot here. This is just one of 6 screenshots from the Discord that I'm going to be going over today. And a lot of this actually just talks about the event in general, as far as I could tell. There was like specific references, or no specific references to players. There were specific tags towards judges, and those judges actually come forward in these posts that we're going to review and talk about some of their perspectives as well. But they say that player a lot, or this player, or the top 8 player. And so a lot of this, as I was reading through, just kind of had to be reread a few times. So I read through it a couple times, and I'm sure as we go through, we're not going to be talking about everything because, again, there are 6 different posts that we have to talk about. Essentially, this first 2 basically go through saying that, hey, there was a lot of issues with the event starting off. There was issues with Melee, the overall kind of server, the tournament registration that it was run on. Some people weren't registered. There were basically a lot of things going on. And I totally get that. And I have a lot of respect for the judges because at the end of the day, most, if not all of the judges usually do this for fun and as something that is like a volunteer, while also being informed and experts on the matter. And also at the beginning of his post, he mentions that if any judges or employees of FG have higher authority on investigating infractions, I've written a few short summaries for specific players for the event on Melee that might prompt some discussion. So he's even escalated this, it looks like, to people above him, potentially. So there may be another person that makes a finalized decision, or FFG makes a finalized decision. This is just one head judge for one event talking about his event at large. And again, we start off with a bunch of issues. Not really all relevant to our discussion today, but things that happen a lot. And there are a lot of things that happen for the judges to deal with. And so there isn't really a lot of blame that should be placed on the judges for the most part. However, at the end of the day, the judges are also responsible for if there are player issues, behavioral issues, if there are gameplay issues that are not resolved, and they don't put their foot down, the actual overall experience of the event falls upon the people who are running it, and that includes the judges. And so that is where potentially some of the blame can be. But again, let's go through the whole thing before you reach your final discussion. As we dive into the second paragraph here, this is in regards to a few judge calls. So we have a few issues that this person talks about. The first major incident being, calling for a judge about minor issues, a bunch of life totals discrepancies, some things with rolling for initiative, nothing that seemed pretty large, right? Basically some minor things that have happened. Honestly, not anything that should have been causing people to get disqualified. But I will say all these minor issues add up. I am not 100% familiar with how the judging system works, but what I do at least have a brief understanding of is it looks like the way people get disqualified is they have a maximum of essentially 10 points that they get penalized, or when penalties come, they get points associated with them. And depending on how big this penalty infraction ends up being, if they reach the 10 points, they will be disqualified. And so if these are minor issues, like, for example, talking back to a judge, I don't know what scale of these of these penalties are, but maybe if they're talking back to a judge or attacking a player in terms of verbally with yelling and things like that, if they are throwing cards or whatever it is, I don't know the scale, but it seems on these, it just seems like disagreements that got passionate. It got maybe a little bit of heat to it, which is totally fine. At the end of the day, the player at the end of one of these results had been making sly, uncomfortable comments towards him, and all these judge calls are unreasonable and uncommon. So it looks like whatever that player was, if this was the top 8 player, then the same player as the one we're going to talk about, but it seems like there were multiple infractions from potentially multiple players that had negative implications towards the event experience, and also people trying to call out the judges. And so this head judge gave that player, again, they call him that player, an escalated penalty and warned him that if they keep this up, they'll have to take more drastic measures. So he didn't receive any further judge calls from that player, it seems like. So I don't think that's the top 8 player that we're going to be talking about from our previous video, but just another addition to kind of the experience of the overall event. It seems like there were not just this one person causing issues, but that potentially the results of the decisions the judges are making weren't definitive enough to where they might have more problems, or, and the most likely situation, there were just some knuckleheads there that day and they just caused some issues, because that is going to happen regardless of what your judge's conclusion will be. There is always going to be people that cause disruptions, and that is not the fault of the judges, but the result of their decisions is the judge's responsibility. And that's a very big distinction to make. But then we jump into the second, and this is where it seems like we're talking about the top 8 and the winner of the tournament. As they say, another incident involved a player that made it to the top 8. All this happened before the cut to top, and I noticed there have been some negative word of mouth from other players indicating a bit of toxicity that the top 8 player harbors. So again, this is all kind of reflected in a ton of the community posts, a ton of the comments, etc., etc., etc. And even the head judge says, I do not disagree, since I've noticed some of his disruptive behavior during a previous planetary qualifier, which again was the same thing that other communities posted about. This is not a first time offense. This is multiple time offense. And this one that I will discuss about later. I was called over because of a disagreement involving life totals. I tried to remedy it to no avail because none of the players could agree. As per usual, one was counting the damage they were taking up, and the other was counting down. This is something that is a little bit strange, because for me, as far as I started playing Star Wars Unlimited, it was always damage up, because it doesn't really make sense to count damage down, because then if you're doing it for like units and stuff, you have to start at, like, let's say you have a Kanan, you have 5 HP, so you put a dice on 5 and then you go to 4, 3, 2, 1. It just was a little bit more confusing than just to put the damage total on there, and that was the same thing for the base. And before we continue on with this post, it looks like another judge mentioned that counting left on a base is incorrect. It should always be damage counted up, and that seems like a best practice in terms of what they should be doing. I'm not 100% sure if that is like a penalty, like a rule that is able to be penalized or anything like that, but it seems like this is the baseline and notes are acceptable. And so both were taking notes, non-top 8 players explaining everything, while the top 8 player stated that he disagrees, but he's not entirely sure if he's right or wrong. Default, unofficial method, so it looks like unofficial method, but again, this person says that it's incorrect, of keeping track of life totals is indicated via base and counting up. Given that counting down is also not incorrect, I had informed both players that they need to come to an agreement. I noticed that the top 8 player was a bit rude and kept trying to coax me into thinking that the non-top 8 player was trying to fault him when all he did was trying to figure out the correct life totals. So immediately, one of the earlier interactions with this player, mind you, with the history, is that he was being rude and that he was trying to basically get the judges on his side and blame the opposing player. This is literally word for word what we've heard from previous interactions with this player in our community posts. Again, the next judge says counting life down on a base is incorrect. And then we follow that up with, this other incident wasn't intentional, but I had to issue a game loss for a round 6 player because he admitted that he kept his sideboard cards in his main deck for the first game. And here's something that I really want to get through, because this is really important for the future of this kind of video. But the head judge states that the player wasn't aware of this and this was his first planetary qualifier, but that they informed him that planetary qualifiers are serious competitive events and they should be aware of the basic rules, and that having sideboard cards at the start of a round in the main deck is not allowed, since it was illegal per MED, which seems like the judge ruling manual potentially. If a player has an illegal deck during a round, he/she is given a game loss and escalated penalty. Player agreed to a game loss instead of a win, and was thus re-edited, informed player that he isn't in trouble, disqualified, or unable to attend future events. And we know that that his error wasn't intentional, but the policy has to be enforced for round 6 since it's a serious tournament. We will come back to that position later. The MED should state the best preference for tracking life totals before determining who's correct when a disagreement occurs, obviously counting up, but I come across the common issue of a damage counter on base versus notes. I typically rule in favor of notes because those are recorded and tracked, whereas we can't rewind and view the past. This is basically a reference to that earlier comment about counting life down on a base is incorrect. And basically they say that the MED should state the best preference for tracking life totals for determining who's correct when a disagreement occurs. It's best preference. So is it a rule, hard rule? Is it not? I don't know. But then this person comes back and says damage should be tracked on the base with tokens or an acceptable replacement per TR 3.1.5. Notes should be in addition to that if the player desires. In addition, so it seems like must have damage tracked with tokens or acceptable replacement. So dice, a life counter that counts up. And notes can be in addition, but you have to have the tokens, which is an interesting kind of rule. Didn't necessarily know about. I didn't know it was that important. To be honest, it probably isn't unless you have a situation like this where one player is a little bit, well, on the unagreeable side. So all of this, basically, earlier instances of the top 8 player, the person we mentioned in the previous video, having some disagreements and having some problems with the judges, and some disagreements between the judges themselves. It looks like the head judge is at odds in a few of these situations with other judges. As you could see, there are many different emotes and responses to the response to the head judge, basically saying that the head judge is wrong. And so this is also important alongside the head judge's position from another player about how serious this tournament is and how that he must issue a game loss despite the player's, well, assuming niceties and lack of knowledge about his mistake, which I totally follow up and agree with this head judge decision. He should be issued a game loss because that is a mistake and it's not legal. And so you should be given a game loss, but it's not that he's in trouble. But that decision should be applied to every decision you make. And we'll get to a point where that's not the case. And then we move on to the next one. 3 different paragraphs here. Lots of it. Okay, guys, as I said, tons and tons and tons of things to talk about. There was later an incident involving the same top 8 player previously when another judge was on duty and arrived to his table for another life total disagreement. This was somewhere around round 5. Apparently the situation prior was more dire. Prior to me being called to the table, the top 8 player dismissed said judge and called me instead as an appeal to the head judge. Here's an important little fact for those of you that don't attend a lot of competitive events. If you disagree in terms of a resolution for a decision, not as like, oh, I just want to hear a different opinion, but that you fundamentally disagree with the reasoning behind it, there is always, as a player's right, an option to go ahead and appeal to the head judge. Now, there are kind of context clues and things you have to make a decision about as a judge. If obviously the person is acting a little bit belligerent and they are a little bit reckless and all that stuff, and they are just disagreeing to disagree, that's one thing. But if you have a pretty reasonable player and they're pretty confident on how this should work out, or they don't necessarily agree with the decision, that's where the appeal can happen. But it seems like the former was the case in this scenario, where they just wanted to hear a second opinion because they just flat out disagree and were a little bit belligerent. So once I arrived before said judge could finish his statement and inform me of what's happening, the top 8 player interrupted him before he could finish speaking and accused that judge that he was accusing him as an attack and doesn't actually care about the life discrepancy and is just ruling in favor of his opponent. Which is really, really important to note. Basically, that player that we talked about yesterday said that this judge is having favoritism towards players and that they are just attacking him. They're accusing him of not taking proper track of a life total and just ruling on the opposing side of the battlefield because of favoritism. That's it. And thus would rule against him because he wasn't a friend or local even before I heard what the judge had to say. So again, not only did this player interrupt the judge before he could speak, but then also accused the judge of having favoritism and attacking him and accusing him of the said disruption or disagreement, which is crazy, by the way. That's already insane. Somewhere around the conversation, the opponent stated the top 8 player threw his leader card at him so he could read what it does. And here's where it gets a little bit interesting as well. I've heard different perspectives from other players about the card being thrown. I wasn't there to witness it, but it didn't seem like he was trying to attack his opponent. Does not matter, by the way, but merely throwing it on the table as an impolite way for his opponent to look at. I had to notify top 8 player that he's not allowed to interrupt a judge later. After the gameplay issue, throwing cards at your opponent across the table is disrespectful, and that judges are trained to be impartial. He is not allowed to be disrespectful towards any judge, even if they aren't head judges, in which he stated, but I can appeal to the head judge. Again, a little bit belligerent. Regardless, it was a bit of a nuisance. I had to brush aside because as a head judge, I had to be impartial and wanted to remedy gameplay issue at first, hoping it would alleviate some of the players' animosity towards one another. This last sentence is a huge red flag for me. Okay. First off, we talk about the throwing a card and trying to attack his opponent. It was never about attacking his opponent. And every single kind of comment I read was that he threw his leader card at his opponent. That's what I read. And maybe that's not necessarily the perfect description because it does have a negative connotation. But what does the head judge say? As a favorable perspective, it seems that merely throwing it on the table in an impolite way for his opponent to look at, which is extremely disrespectful and definitely causes your opponent to be uncomfortable. I can't tell you how many times I've been in an in-paper game where I don't even want to play anymore and I can't focus because my opponent on the other side of the battlefield is being such an unsportsman-like player where it's just hard to focus and you don't know what their next response is going to be. And that's exactly what this sounds like, even in the most favorable of lights. And then this last sentence, the head judge is saying that this extremely disrespectful player cutting off your judge and accusing your judges of being impartial as a nuisance that he had to brush aside because he had to be impartial. That's not being impartial. That's just not necessarily actually issuing consequences when they are deserved, right? It's not about remedying gameplay issue first. This player deliberately displaying unsportsmanlike conduct, disagreeing with the authority in the matter, and then accusing the authorities in the matter of being impartial is not a nuisance. This is a problem. This is a problem now, and it is causing massive discomfort for the players around you. And as a judge, it's not just about gameplay issues. And I think this is where my huge disagreement comes in. It's not just about gameplay issues in these scenarios. If you are a judge and you come over to answer gameplay issues, that's the first step, right? But at the same time, you act as a mediator. And the great judges will be acting as a mediator to resolve some sort of problem because it's not always just gameplay issues. It's oftentimes a ton of emotion, a ton of attitude associated with those gameplay issues that forces you to cause a head judge call. if it was just gameplay issues, it's usually a very simple thing, and a standard judge could finish it off. But sometimes, in the rare occurrence, you'll have a gameplay issue that does cause a head judge call. This is not the case. This was because he is literally accusing and, well, basically insulting the judge of being impartial. And so this is a huge red flag for me. As we go onwards, we have, anyways, the issue was another simple life disagreement. Not simple. Maybe the issue at hand was simple, but the overall result was not simple. It didn't even matter in the long run. I had to rule in favor of the top 8 player because he kept track of life totals and recorded in a notepad, whereas his opponent didn't keep track of life totals and relied on the top 8 player on being honest. Totally fine. If that's your ruling, sure, there should have been penalties applied to that top 8 player outside of just the discrepancy. It's the attitude, the disrespect, the accusations, etc. At least, again, in my opinion. I couldn't decide who was being honest or not, but just ruled in favor of the top 8 player due to his life being tracked. Again, totally fair reason there. Personally, it felt like a silly incident that stirred more personal drama than it should have, and the blames from both sides were basically who is the more toxic one. Again, I don't know how this is the conclusion. If you look at the prior paragraph, the head judge himself literally states that the top 8 player interrupted his judge, didn't let him speak, and accused him of being impartial, and then also still saying that he was disrespectful in throwing the card at his opponent to look at. He said that. The head judge said that, and then followed to say that it was blame from both sides and who was the more toxic one. Maybe they didn't describe the whole scenario and didn't describe the other player. Sure. But regardless, that was not a simple, silly incident. That was an incredibly egregious results of a judge call from the top 8 player. To note, I've had instances at prior PQ judge calls, October 12, Las Vegas, involving the same top 8 player where other players tell me to keep an eye on his toxicity and notice that the calls somehow end up as blames against his opponent. There's a bit of a pattern here where he rushes actions before an opponent finishes their actions or triggers before they stated their intentions. I warranted an escalated penalty towards the top 8 player and then later informed him that I will take it back for some reason, hoping that he will behave. What? Okay, all right. We're reading here that he had a pattern of completely being toxic. I was just so blown away right now. He was just toxic in prior PQs. Literally a pattern, okay? And he warranted an escalated penalty towards the top 8 player. But then, despite this planetary qualifier and planetary qualifiers in general being serious competitive events, decided that he'll take it back on good behavior. What? I've never heard of a judge taking back penalties if you received a penalty. That just doesn't happen, really. In terms of good behavior, like if I'm going through, maybe this is like across multiple planetary qualifiers or what, but in terms of description here, I just don't understand, right? If we just read this again, there's a bit of a pattern where he rushes actions before an opponent finishes their actions or triggers before they state their intentions. Sure, not a very sportsmanlike thing to do. Not necessarily something that really warrants like huge action in my opinion, but this is a pattern on top of his toxicity, which causes the disagreements that we're probably seeing in the previous judge calls. So he warranted an escalated penalty towards the top 8 player and then later informed that he will take it back for some reason, hoping that he will behave. So it looks like he issued the escalated penalty during this planetary qualifier because he noted him the top 8 player. Okay, maybe it was the prior planetary qualifier, but still, why are you taking the issue? If he did escalate or have an escalated penalty in the previous planetary qualifier, and then you're noticing the massive amount of disrespect, why would you take it back? And why would you not issue an escalated penalty again based on the actions that you're describing here? And then he also states, for some reason. There's no reason, there's no description of a reason why he would do this. It's just like, oh, for some reason, on good behavior. And I know I am definitely on the opposite side of things here at this point in the discussion or in the review, because to me, this makes zero sense. A. B. There seems to be a very, very different evaluation of what has happened between the vast majority of players, including the other judges, which we'll get to, and the community, and this head judge. And that's, at the end of the day, the biggest thing. There is a massive amount of uncomfortable opinions and feelings in the huge event. And it honestly soured the taste of the vast majority of the community that actually witnessed these things happen. And yet, to the head judge, it's a nuisance, a silly incident, a minor disagreement. These are the words that are coming out of this explanation. Now, here's where we come back and we definitely shed some light on potentially this is more of just the head judge just trying to do a good job on gameplay. Because as we mentioned, or as he mentioned here, perhaps I was being a bit too soft and it was incorrect. But from there onwards, I didn't have any more heated incidents later during the tournament. And he started acting more respectfully towards other players, albeit in a seemingly forceful way. I noticed he was behaving more respectfully towards me instead of others, given that I was the head judge, and it seemed more covert in its negativity when I wasn't around. So they say, well, I didn't notice it, but only like a little bit I noticed it. As far as I understand here, it seemed like he was being forceful and that his negativity was there when the head judge wasn't around. And we're at the top 8, which means there's less players and more judges focused on them. And so that might just be why. Okay. Or maybe he made the top 8 and he's less, pushing around people because that's his strategy. I have no idea. But in terms of the head judge's case, he says, perhaps I was being a bit too soft and it was incorrect. And I think that's where most of us land on, is that it was too soft and it was incorrect, and that it caused massive disruption across not only the entire tournament, but also the top 8 itself. And as we say, as we start from the next paragraph, the top 8 player obviously made it to the top 8. And there are ones that examined his plays and there was no indication of cheating and no longer stirred up any further drama. He won his standing and followed every mandatory stuff. Once the tournament ended, I had to pull him aside for a chat. I congratulated him for his standing and informed him that there has been a fair amount of negative feedback from other players in the tournament for his apparent rudeness, and this isn't the first time it has happened. He stated that he knows a lot of players and that his friends would say the opposite thing. But guess who wouldn't say the opposite thing? The head judge and the judges around you. Which, who cares what the community says at this point? If you're the head judge, you need to insert your own observations at this point. It's one thing to say the community. It's another thing to say, hey, I noticed that there were a lot of incidents today, and I noticed that you were incredibly disrespectful to my other judges. You cut them off, and there were multiple complaints on top of that from other customers, other community members. It doesn't matter if we have, this person's opinion versus this person's opinion. All that matters at the end of the day is the head judges and judges' opinion when it comes to rules, violations, when it comes to being disrespectful as a player. Like, yes, the community can escalate complaints, and there are some third-party reasons as to why the community matters, such as this video, right? Because things like this will happen if a judge call doesn't get made or the community isn't happy. But at the end of the day, in terms of authority in that moment, it all falls on the head judge. And so, guess what? Doesn't really matter what the friends say. Fortunately, the head judge did say, I informed him that I wasn't against or in favor of him. Okay, sure. You're not against or in favor of him because I wouldn't know the full truth. And he made it to top 8 standing fair and square. Not necessarily. Who knows? Not necessarily. Maybe his disruptive nature caused players to be off their game. And because no punishment, he didn't get that fair and square, but intimidated players into making mistakes. But I advised him that he needs to be more friendly and respectful towards other players in the future, because when he interrupts other players and judges, that's not allowed. He nodded and agreed, but stated that he has no hostility at all against other players, and that players are acting spiteful against him simply out of jealousy, because he had experience competing at high levels at other card games, and it happens. It does not happen like this. It does not. Okay, there are jealous players out there, 100%, but those are few and far between, like the player in question, and they get punished when they act disrespectfully. And there absolutely is community talk about some players when they are jealous. But when you have a massive amount of community, as well as the head judge observing you be disrespectful, and then you go and say that it's because they're acting spiteful, when the head judge literally witnessed you be disrespectful and cut off your judge, that's not a reason. It's literally because you did it. Again, I'm only referring to the head judge statement here and then the head judge statement previously. It's literally all in the same message. He literally mentioned that he was accusing his judge as an attack and doesn't actually care about the life discrepancy situation. It's just ruling in favor of what his opponent has. So he's literally accusing the judge of favoritism, incompetence, and cutting him off, and being disrespectful, and still also impolitely tossing cards across the table, whether it was thrown at an opponent or not. So this just isn't the case. I let him know that even though we're all here to win, he still needs to maintain his integrity, and impolite conduct isn't favorable in the long run. I also informed him that he needs to let other players finish what they have to say, and that not everyone is simply there to bias against him. He needs to play and speak more carefully when he's making decisions. From there onwards, he agreed to what I said. This all happened at the end of the night, and it was the final thing I had to do for the planetary qualifier. Overall, both my floor judge that I've mentioned for the event did a stellar job, even though they had to handle some difficulty we managed to pull through. All judge rulings deck checks were handled promptly and weren't as serious as the other ones mentioned. I'm sure, because no one is as belligerent as this top 8 player in question, right? But then we dive in to the next one, where we talk about the other judge's opinion on the matter. First, we have another judge responding to, I warranted an escalated penalty towards the top 8 player, and then later informed him that I will take it back, which I mentioned is the big red flag for me alongside the small nuisance. And this judge says, why though? If the penalty is warranted, issue it. If it isn't, don't issue it. You put yourself in a very awkward position, since now it's a feeling as time goes on, and even more so if the player ends up with 10 penalty points and a self-disqualification. But if you remove this penalty, like you said, you might get to stay and play. Policy also doesn't allow us to do this. So currently, the head judge is not following policy. And also, anyone that has had this situation knows exactly what this judge is talking about. You either issue something or you don't. If you go into this middle ground, you start on this path of constantly having to check up on this player and keep them in check. It's completely irresponsible. Apparently, the situation prior is more dire to me being called to the table. The top 8 player dismissed the judge and called me instead as an appeal to the head judge. And as this judge says, appealing is the player's right. If they listen to the floor judge's ruling and immediately appeal, that's okay. If they disrespectfully say, yeah, whatever, appeal, maybe less so. You had to be there in the moment, I'm sure, but a quick appeal is not generally insulting. It's difficult to determine the timeline of the ruling, conversations, and appeal from the text. 100% agree. If it's one to say, hey, I disagree with this, I would like to appeal to the head judge. It's another thing to say, yeah, you don't even know what you're talking about. Can I have the head judge? Okay, completely different. But merely throwing it on the table is an impolite way for his opponent to look at. This is what the head judge said. Throwing it on the table in an impolite way. That's the best light that you can put on that situation. And apparently it did happen. So he did throw a card in his opponent's direction. Period, according to the head judge. But, well, I shouldn't say that, not according to that judge. This is at least what his favorable interpretation of it was. You had to be there, I'm sure, but throwing things is captured under USC aggressive behavior, disqualification, and USC minor 4 points. And more than one player said the player threw the card, then you may want to lean towards a penalty here after investigating further. And this is something that I'm really, really shocked about. Ironically, the top 8 player kept saying, oh, these judges are ruling in favor of their opponents. It seems like the head judge constantly is viewing the top 8 player in a favorable light and not issuing penalties slash what do they call this again? The escalated penalty and additional points for penalty points for self-disqualification because they want to focus on the gameplay. Weird. Very weird. Yeah, I'm not sure why I removed his penalty at the moment, since that could have been also incited more abuse, especially subtle ones when I'm not around towards other players. My weird thought at the moment was, here's what I can do if you keep acting up, but also here's what I can do if you're nice and you behave. That's not at all what should be the thought process of a judge. It's, did you do it? Did you not? If you did it, you get issued a penalty. If you didn't, then we'll move on. That it doesn't even make any sense. Like, hey, I'm going to issue a game loss for you right now, but if you don't actually put your sideboard cards in your main deck for future games, I'll remove that game loss after we've already completed these rounds. That's not how these things usually work. Again, I don't know the exact ruling and the policy and associated with FFG, but in terms of every other trading card game, I've never even heard anything like this or even close to this logic. I've dealt with toxic individuals in the past, and they always like to present a positive image to those who know they can. They know they can't one up or compete against, and they will try to bully those who aren't when they're not being seen. So literally, this head judge knows exactly what this player is about and still decided to act as he did. I'm not saying that the player isn't one of those or is one of those, but I've heard stories from others that he is. Issues that only few incidents that I've caught him in warranted a warning were once in the 2 PQs. First wasn't as severe, and the moment I corrected the gameplay, he was quiet during the whole event. And second was this one, which happened again, albeit more severe, but also behaved himself after I called him out for interrupting a judge. If this is a repeatable pattern, all I can do is report and warn, since I don't know his previous history involving other PQs. You also need to go beyond more than one serious offense for me to issue a round loss or escalate even further, but if he's willing to behave after he's warned, then there is no legitimate reason for me to warrant or drastic measures. I agree if he's willing to behave, but we just talked about how you had previous experience with him in previous planetary qualifiers. He has a history. And then this is just, he says more severe. What did he do? He had a disagreement, called the head judge, complained that the head judge was being unfair and impartial, accused of him of being favoritism towards his opponent, basically calling him incapable of doing his job because he was not being an impartial judge, interrupted him, didn't let him speak, and also reported from a lot of other players, also threw cards towards his opponent. This is one of the most severe things that I've seen in a lot of tournaments. Like, it doesn't get usually more severe than that. Like, we don't start fights in trading card game terms. It happens. It does happen, okay? But this is really bad. Like, you don't do this. Oh, and then here's where it gets really nasty for the head judge. Picari Wet, the judge that was referenced in every single other comment from the head judge, the floor judge, says that appealing as the player, in response to this other judge's message, in terms of the appealing as the player's right and you had to be there, says that I'm aware of that. The player in question cut me off aggressively as I was trying to inquire more information. He verbatim yelled, "You're wrong. I disagree with your ruling. I'm escalating to head judge." That is a whole different light on what the head judge was alluding to. It wasn't like an appeal. It was more of the disrespectful, I disagree with you. I want to hear a different opinion. Especially if he's yelling and claiming that you're wrong. Not that I disagree, it's you're wrong, meaning that I am right. And you could say that I disagree is kind of saying that same thing, but it's all about delivery. It's all about tone. It's all about communication skills. Come on, we know this, guys. Assuming you're an adult. Like, this is just standard human stuff. But that's not all. He then proceeded to threaten to report me to FFG in front of the head judge when I asked him to please be quiet for a moment and let me and the head judge have a discussion, to which he replied, also in front of the head judge, "You can't tell me what to do. I'll do whatever I want." He also tried to undermine the floor judge decisions by accusing us of being biased towards Vegas players since they addressed us first by first name instead of calling us judge. We had our first names on our name tags. I'm not trying to overturn the head judge's decision since it was his call at the end of the day. I would like to have a frame of reference on what the penalty should have been issued for a situation like this or what others would have done. And then here's what another judge said. Assuming this is the head judge, because I'm assuming that they get roles in their Discord. The greens are like floor judges. The teals are the head judge. That shouldn't fly. Surprised you let him continue to play in the event. And then Picari said, I'm not the head judge. And then he said, yeah, I meant from head judge perspective. If he's yelling at a floor judge, I'm sure it's disruptive to the event. And the head judge may have heard. We need a lesson on pulling the trigger on disqualifications. It's never comfortable, but it sounds like this player was an extreme disruption the entire event. Assuming it won't deter you from judging more, did this player win the whole thing? And we know he did. So again, a massive, massive fail. Massive fail. At least in my opinion. Here's where the head judge of our Las Vegas planetary qualifier comes in. I believe a disqualification should be the final last decision for the most severe cases. Yeah, 100% agree. And this is a severe case, period. I would issue a game or a match loss before having to disqualify a player. Yes, his response to the judge was disruptive, and his call for me as head judge should have been involved, asking his permission in a more respectful tone. However, the severity of the case wasn't a disqualification. He was issued an escalated warning. No, he wasn't. Apparently. Well, I shouldn't say that. He was issued an escalated penalty, but then was overturned, I guess. So this is different from what he said earlier, I believe, and did not continue his bad behavior onwards. Yes, apparently. He played throughout top 8 in a legal manner, wasn't further disruptive throughout the entire event. It doesn't matter if he wasn't disruptive for the rest of the time. He already caused a huge issue, which completely ruined the whole top 8's experience. Whenever he needed clarification, he would ask me, you know, also follow through with legal gameplay rulings that I had explained, enforced, clarified, confirmed, etc., etc. I know that this player has a negative reputation amongst the community here in Vegas, and it's possible that he's only behaving nicely when I'm around, but he did win his top 8 matches legally and respectfully. Again, in terms of gameplay, but there's a whole human element to this that this head judge is missing. Humans aren't just, I play a card and I make the perfect decision every time. It's all about headspace. That's like a large portion of these trading card games. Predicting what your opponent's going to be doing. Kind of basically out-minding them, out-gaming them from their minds based on what they have, based on what the decisions they're going to be making. And if you're having a situation where your opponent's super disruptive to the point where it's actually causing problems to other people, this is going to completely take over people's headspace. If there's a trail of evidence that adds up, I think this person should also be cognizant of it. I might have been soft on the escalated penalty reduction, but I did not see him exasperate anything further. The Vegas community has the right to be unhappy about his behavior, but the solution of simply forcing a disqualification would be for the absolute worst, which I do not believe this player has crossed that threshold. This person says, yes, he did, and no, that alone won't deter me from judging. He was disrupted for that intermediate period over the minor life discrepancy, which he was exasperated into accusations as personal attacks as opposed to a cooperation towards solving a minor issue. So I just wanted to solve the gist of it and make it impersonal, but then it became a blame game on both sides instead of rectifying the gameplay issue. It's not impersonal. It is personal. That's what happens when someone insults your judge. Period. You can't just make it impersonal as a head judge when the player in question is making it personal. That is grounds for penalties being issued so that it doesn't become personal. That's the whole point, right? If you don't do anything, then it will become personal more and more. You can't just take the person out of it. Again, there's a human element associated with this stuff. Moment he interrupted the judge, opponent then stated that he threw his leader at him, which then made me question what he meant by threw. One side said it was a direct attack. Other side, he flicked it across the table because the opponent can't read. In my mind, I'm just thinking there's too much going on. Let's solve the gameplay issue first and then solve the other stuff later. It's not a gameplay issue, though. This is not a gameplay issue. The gameplay issue is 1 life total. It's nothing, right? This is a personal issue. That's what it was. And in this case, even if it was just flicking it across the table, that's incredibly disrespectful. And it was, as we said earlier, any sort of throwing element should be grounds for, apparently, according to their rulebook, for penalty points. And then lastly, considering that unsporting conduct and event disruption tend to be more severe penalties than simple gameplay errors, I would tend to think those are more important to address. This person sounds like a nightmare to have at an event. Another judge comes in and says the same thing that I've been saying this whole time. There is a human element to this stuff, and you need to address it. And that wraps up everything that they had to share in this regard. And here's what I'll say, because I know I, to be fair, I don't want to say harsh, because I don't think I was harsh, but definitely on the opposite side of things with the Las Vegas head judge. I 100% disagree with his decision making. I don't think that it was due to some sort of malicious intent. I don't believe that this Las Vegas planetary qualifier head judge is trying to be like favorited or showing favoritism towards this top 8 player, or that they were in leagues together or anything like that. I just think that his headspace was focused on the completely wrong thing, and it caused for a massive, massive problem that people literally look back and say that it soured their entire planetary qualifier experience. And again, if we go back to this right here, in which the judge in question, again, this is the floor judge speaking about his own experience, saying that this person's going to report him to FFG, and that the head judge and the floor judge have no control over what they can tell him to do, and that he'll do whatever he wants, is completely out of pocket. Completely. And this is not something that I'm alone on, apparently. We're seeing that multiple other head judges, assuming, again, this is the same, or just judges in general, are saying that this shouldn't have happened. He shouldn't have been able to continue to play in the event, regardless of if he's able to play in future events. That's a whole nother decision. I don't agree with permanent banning here. This is something where you issue a penalty, and if he continues to do it, right? Because apparently he wasn't issued a penalty in the previous planetary qualifier that actually was meaningful enough. You disqualify him from this. If he comes back and he repeats the same process, then you prevent him from playing in any tournament locally, right? And then maybe you expand it towards FFG entirely and prevent him from playing into their melee.gg signups, right? But in this case, he is disrupting your whole event. Your whole event. And at the same time, undermining the other authorities in the matter to where you are now the only authority in the matter, which is completely wrong, right? And I agree 100% with Chris here. We need a lesson on pulling the trigger on disqualifications. It's never comfortable, but it sounds like this player was an extreme disruption. And I completely agree. And I also agree with the Las Vegas head judge when he says that it should be for the most severe cases. But I think where he went wrong is that thinking that this was a simple gameplay issue. That's what makes it even worse in my eyes. The fact that this is a one life total discrepancy, and we're sitting there yelling at the floor judge. We are escalating the situation to basically saying that they're going to report them to the higher ups, and also basically telling them that he has no authority in the matter and that he'll do whatever he wants in these games and at the event. Is completely out of line. Completely out of line. And the head judge and the floor judge's perspective don't even match. Which at the end of the day makes me think this head judge is describing the situation and doesn't actually agree with his own opinion. And that he's looking at this and making it seem a little bit less intense than it otherwise was. And that to me is not okay. Not okay. This player, again, as I stated yesterday, should have been disqualified from any event. And I even mentioned yesterday that, I'm not about trying to call out someone specifically. But I mean, at this point, everyone kind of has called him out anyways. This player should not be allowed to play in these events, or at least be issued a penalty that forces him to rethink how he's acting in these events. At the end of the day, the community is only as solid as the authorities that are protecting the community are. If we have these people just roaming around, allowed to continue in their events, and in fact win the whole thing, again, not saying that this player is bad in terms of gameplay wise at all. In order to win a planetary qualifier, even while being disruptive, you do have to be a very competent player, generally speaking. Now, granted, these planetary qualifiers usually are 50 to 60 players, so it's not like they're the most intense events ever. Like when you go to a Magic the Gathering regional qualifier, usually there's 8, I think in my case was 1,100 players. Those events are significantly larger to the point where you have to have an insanely good score, right? And those are a top 8 match too. Top 8, to get to top 8 is crazy. But regardless, you do have to know how to play the game. That's not at all the thing I'm concerned about. It's the overall outcome of this player on a very important and very competitive event. The competitive integrity is shattered from this area. And that's the biggest thing. And I might have some people completely roasting me in the comments because they disagree with me. And I know I took a very strong position in this video. But as I said, I am one that is 100% about focusing on the human issues before the gameplay issues if that comes up. If someone says, hey, I did this, they did that, I don't know how this works, could you tell me how this works? Okay, give them the simple gameplay issue ruling. If someone comes by and they say, my opponent is being disingenuous, this judge is being disingenuous and also favoriting my opponent, and also he doesn't know what he's talking about, he should be reported to FFG, and this guy has no way of telling me what to do because I can do whatever I want. That's a whole different ball game. Okay, we need to be focusing on these personal issues because that's oftentimes what leads to these extremely poor outcomes. And it doesn't matter if this was just the one case. It literally ruined the tournament for many other players. And that's the issue in hand, right? By not doing this, yeah, maybe you have preserved this one player's ability to play in the game, but you've also ruined so many other players' experiences, and you may have actually helped the player in question win because everyone else doesn't feel protected and comfortable around this player because you did not issue a hard enough punishment. And that, to me, is an extreme disservice for the vast majority of the community, and that is not something that's okay with me at all. And especially coming from for a portion of the community that literally has nowhere else to go. Like everyone that played in this event, where are they going to go? They can post it on Reddit. I don't know if FFG is going to do anything about this necessarily. And I also don't know if other video makers, other content creators can even talk about this. But I can, so I will. And I will state what I think should have happened. Right? 100%. And I agree with the other head judges in this comment post, right? This is the biggest thing that really shocks me before I let you all go, is that literally this guy, Chris, Pakari, and Ashlyn all disagree with the other head judge multiple times in this post. Disagree with their rules, disagree with the policy violations, disagree with the result, and disagree with the logic behind it. We're not alone. And not only that, but also if you look at a lot of these other posts, you don't see any reactions. Every reaction is on the people who disagree with the head judge in question. So clearly, there is something going on here that the head judge does not describe properly. Or in this case, they just don't follow the policy completely and utterly, which is a little bit unfortunate. Doesn't mean that the judge won't do something to correct this in the future. Doesn't mean that you should not attend events in the local area. But just be careful is all I can really say. Because there may not be a result that actually is satisfactory. And there may not be a solution to the disruptive nature of some of these players. And that is a little bit unfortunate. But again, still give this a chance. It does seem like it's happened multiple times, and heck, I even have a lot of people like close in terms of like my patron and other friends and things like that basically say that a lot of stores do even just opt out of tournaments because of some of the judges and some of the people not being able to enforce a lot of these things like this Las Vegas Planetary Qualifier. And to be honest, if that happened, I would not return. I wouldn't go back. And I haven't in some of my local stores. I've had situations where I'll start a draft, I do the draft, and then the store owner ends up like getting really frustrated from the first round, drops, comes back, and then restarts the whole pairing to add himself back in the middle of round 2, so they repair us. I never went back to that store again. Those types of situations. Doesn't even have to go ahead and be a situation where the person's actively insulting you or actively yelling or actively disagreeing. Even in a situation like that, which isn't nearly as severe as this, it made me completely uncomfortable, completely shattered any competitive integrity that I had for that event, and completely made me so that I really felt like I couldn't comment on anything. Even my opponent did something wrong, it felt like I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want to incite some sort of argument or incite some sort of rage that the people would go on. That's what happens, and that's exactly what's happening to these players in question in result of no penalty being issued. And that's way more important than trying to protect one single player, is trying to protect the actual competitive integrity of the event. And I could sit here talking about this for hours, to be honest. And I don't even know how long this video already is. It looks like I've been recording for like 40 minutes or something like that, but I've said enough. I want to hear what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. You may disagree with me, you may not. I want to hear what you have to say. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all for the next one.